Okay, so we're live. Hello, YouTube. I'm Christopher Robert Stumm, and it's been a while. I've been on vacation, so I apologize for the absence. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
Okay, yeah, I guess I'll start. I'm Alan. I've been in a few episodes. Hi, how you doing? Okay, you can't respond to me. Duncan, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thanks. I've also been in a few episodes. Yeah.
We have Carla here. Carla, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I am Carla Cole, and this is my first episode.
And Carla, if it's worth mentioning, she's a professor of political science. She has a master's from University of Florida. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, and she's got at least 27 years of experience on the subject. And in this topic, we will be discussing race and racism. I think that the way we'll set this up is first we're going to pour through a lot of data. Data specifically to kind of set a tone, but also to a tone insofar as like to give people a clue of how we're going to approach this, which is really we're going to try to approach it analytically. But once we've assessed a lot of data, we're then going to dive into some philosophy. So I say without further delay, you guys want to jump in?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So
first of all, though, Duncan, who is that?
That's
probably
my wife.
That's probably his wife.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and let me apologize in advance if my kiddos.
It's fine,
disrupt.
That's part of the spontaneity with this, and that's kind of how I like it. I feel like when I rig it too much, I lose the ability to interact with the audience as efficiently. So I want to first start with sources, and the reason I want to start with sources is I've noticed that there's a subset of individuals who usually reason from sources that they find online, and specifically some subset, which I claim to be non-empty, they reason from statistical inference. So there's usually an article that throws out a statistic from which a person reading that article takes that statistic, and then I don't know what a person reading that would think. There's a bevy of possibilities, but
I would say assumes it to be fact or truth or whatever label you want to assign to that.
Yeah,
Right.
well, I think with a lot of people there is a problem in that they are prone to believe what they hear, and it's maybe not so much of a problem as it is just people are naturally trusting to sources that they're familiar with. If they hear something from their friends, they'll believe it unless something comes out to subvert that later. If they hear it from the news that they watch, they believe it. They don't necessarily research and try and find out where that statement is coming from.
Yeah. So Alan, I would, in response to that, make 2 points. One would be, hi Wes, I thought you would be on this. One would be that I would say that people would take as truth what they hear if it aligns with their with their views. Which brings me to the second part of your comment, right? Which is you mentioned the news they watch, and I think that's very important because people do tend to watch news that aligns with their partisan views or whatever social views they have.
Yeah, well, we naturally
make a good point there.
We naturally form these echo chambers because we tend to create friends with people who engage in similar activities and think similarly to the way that we do. So the information.
A whole other discussion. I don't know if that's natural or learned.
Gotcha.
That's probably for a different.
But it is something. It is something worth pointing out that it's like most people do not have a very diverse diet of information because their belief system tends to define their social groups and the access points that they go to for new information. So It's all like it all comes in through that bias.
And so I want to get this kicked off because I'm afraid we're going to go off on a tangent. I think we can philosophize after we've got a lot of data to pour through. And so what I'd like you guys to do, feel free to interrupt me while I go through the data. I'd like us to talk around this while we go through it, and then
I'd love to interrupt you.
That's fine. Okay. So let's just start this off. I wrote some software with C++ that basically for a repository of websites and specifically articles would find sources and determine common sources between articles and find a point of commonality and citation. And so I've just, from that set, I can't run the software now because it's going to affect my CPU. I just have a laptop. But I have just picked, it's not really random, pseudo randomly, one of those websites. So here's one such website.
Well, okay, but just before we start looking into the website, are you gonna make the software that you wrote available to people watching the video?
I'll try to upload it. Yeah.
Okay.
So what we have here, okay, it's just I have this website with an article, not secure. You guys can see this, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have killed by police during arrest by circumstances, and here we have partitioning accordance to race, and then we have the citation. So let's just click this citation. Now it's not by happenstance that I expected to find it again, because it's one. This is one of the articles that links to this source. So can you guys see the other page that is pulled up?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to close this one. So you guys can literally, I'm going to leave all links in the description so we can go real slow through this, and you can literally follow. You can pause the video and just follow if you're watching after the fact, or in real time. You can, I guess you'd have to see the title and the URL. That may be impractical.
Well, what you can do is, I'm sorry, what you can do is throw the links into the live chat for the people who are watching live.
Yeah, I don't want to clutter it, but I'll just do that. So here's the link.
Okay, Christopher, I'm getting some messages of people who aren't able to enter. What do I need to
enter the chat, or
enter to view the episode?
I would refresh the page and probably go to the front page of the Guild of Inquiry, the homepage, and once you're there, go to video on YouTube, and it should be outlined in red. And in fact, let me see if I can just show exactly. You would go. Let's see, Guild of Inquiry. There it is. You guys can see this?
No, it looks like you're still on ProPublica to me.
If I send the link that you sent, that will bring them into.
I'll send a link in chat.
I don't know that the link.
Technical difficulties. Cue the technical difficulties music.
It's fine. So all you're gonna do is. I'm going to actually send you on Facebook the link to take them here.
All right, that sounds great. And then I'll post that on Facebook so that people can join. Thank you, Christopher.
Yep. And my mother just shared the link too. I'm sorry about the speed. I've got a lot of programs running on this potato. All right, so let's just.
Are you sure it's a potato?
Well, not literally.
No, see, it's a chain of potatoes, and they're all turned.
All right. I mean, I was just wondering if you could be sure that the thing you believe to which you're referring is.
In fairness, I never claimed to know. In fairness,
I know, Christopher.
Yeah. So
with enough potatoes connected in series,
Yep. There we go.
There's got to be an algorithm for that.
Okay, so I've sent you the link through Facebook Messenger. That should be the one that they go to, and they should see it.
Thank you.
Now, are we ready to proceed?
Well, we want to make sure that we can still see your screen because it looks like it. Okay, yeah, we can see it.
Okay, so this is the article, and there are at least, if memory serves, 257 articles that cite this source, and this published in 2014, and it's ProPublica, I believe is the enunciation, or ProPublica. I don't know if it's Hispanic or not.
You mean Latin?
Dominicana. Yeah, right. Well, I don't know if that's Latin, but so if we scroll down from the study, we find this is the problem. Okay, so first of all, let's look at the citation. Each of the citations is, well, their website, which is an organization. This is not peer reviewed. This is an organization, and most of its citations are to itself, but most worrisome is right here. So this says it calculated a statistical figure called a risk ratio by dividing the rate of Black homicide victims by the rate of white victims. This ratio, commonly used in epidemiology, gives an estimate for how much more at risk Black teenagers were to be killed by police officers. There's a typo here because there should be a space, but oh well. Risk ratios have varying levels of precision, no shit, depending on a variety of mathematical factors. Okay, so this is not a valid statistical method of inference. This is bullshit. This is the problem with people getting statistics from sources without understanding that you can't just read data points. And I'd like to persuade the people watching, I'd like to unpack why you should not do this. And so, again, we'll take this a step at a time and unpack what's really going on and why there are problems with this. But this is the first. This is an example. It's not the example. I have a bevy of them, but I want to fit them in a sufficient time. So now I'm going to stop sharing this because I want to now pull up a search for data. So what I want is I don't want someone's interpretation of data. Notice that the website that I shared with you, specifically that publication, there's no raw data. It's not peer reviewed, and the method discussed makes no tenable sense in terms of how you would handle a body of data for statistical evidence.
Because there's a commercial.
Hello.
Can't do this.
Hey there. All right, so let me pull up in this an example. Just gonna, here we go. Okay, so I basically wanted to find raw data, not a person's interpretation of the data. And so I'm going to screen share now with you guys my attempts to find said data sources. So first, we start with, well, that's unfortunate, but kind of funny. This is, you guys, you've got a paywall here, so you can't see it, but this is, if you look up here in the URL, I don't know if you guys can see, this is the original thing that we just discussed. And so now if we go down to, I'm going to share this one next. Okay, let me just stop sharing.
Do you have to
Okay.
end sharing and then reshare to get?
Yeah, okay, so let me, yeah, you do. It's clunky, but you know, until we get more traction, then I'll improve my software. But for now, it's, all right, so now I'm going to do another screen share of this. Okay, so Washington Post. So I started here. I'm searching for raw data pertaining to deaths in association with police, from which we can infer dimensions of race, of age, location, etc. I'm looking for a set of data points. And so I begin with this article. There's a paywall here, but it will be linked in the description. So basically, you'll have to take my word for it that if you scroll down in this article, which again will be linked, you will find that they have a body of data which they claim supports what they affirm in this article. And this is, again, this is the Washington Post. So most people would consider this somewhat, again, of a tenable source. But I'd like to now pull up their raw data, which you can download.
Yeah, so I would argue that in terms of academia, the Washington Post, the New York Times would
It's
be
bullshit.
considered.
Yeah, it's bullshit.
Well, they would be considered legitimate sources in that they engage in fact checking, but not necessarily scientific sources.
And that's what I mean
in
when I
terms
say
of
that.
data analysis. Yeah. Hi, Sherry. Welcome. My colleague, who is a historian and an expert on world religion, has joined.
Welcome. We're
Well,
glad to have you aboard.
One thing I would like to ask Carla is for this type of information, because I believe what we're looking at is data concerning law enforcement and racial disparity in actions from law enforcement. Do you know of any better sources of data to look at instead of just news media?
Well, so the news media aren't gathering their own data, right? I tend to use the Department of Justice but or Census Bureau or data from peer-reviewed journals. However, I think we have to acknowledge that this data is imperfect.
Yeah.
And it marks one of the differences between the hard sciences and the social sciences, right? The human error component and the social, cultural, all of those factors that play into the acquisition of data that create limitations regarding the reliability of it.
Right. So I'd like to get into specifics here of what we can find problematic with these data sets as an example. Okay. So let's look at this one. And the first concern I have is, of course, it's not clear how we can check that these aren't made up. So the best I could do is I found basically an algorithm for searching for names in association with conjuncted ages and dates to corroborate I guess, an obituary. But the problem is I wasn't able to affirm many of the cases. And it's very difficult for me to check this data set. And I don't think I have sufficient time. Maybe if I had more time, I could. But I wanted a better data set.
Did you have like a program that searched through all the data, or were you just checking a few items individually?
Because it's string. So you have to basically like cut the string for certain words and such, and then you have like an auto clicking function that you can basically copy and paste and do a search that way. So it's basically it was difficult for me to actually check this data, and I want to show like I do not have a conclusion about the validity of this data, but I think I found what I claim was the best data I could find. And I'd like to share that one. I'm just acknowledging that for this set of data, or this sample, as it were, I'm unable to affirm beyond reasonable doubt the veracity of this sample of data. But what I would like to do, keeping that in mind, is just I wanted something that was easier to check. And so what I had was right here. I'd just like to, so I'm going to stop sharing, and now I'm going to open this. Okay. So now I'm going to screen share this again. Okay, here we go. And you guys should be able to see that. So I found this website. You guys can see me scrolling. This is Fatal Encounters, and it's basically what it says right here. We say this clearly because I'm spending way too much time on social media explaining what we do, and it distracts from the actual collection of the data. We try to document all deaths that happen when police are present or that are caused by the police, on duty, off duty, criminal, line of duty, federal, yada, yada, yada. We enable people to filter out the deaths they aren't interested in examining, e.g. they have a search function. If you want intentional use of force and additional, so that's specifying what your search criteria can be. Also, we make the data for everyone, but it's not free to collect. So that they're not, there's funding. Usually the website should be aware that I don't much website. It's only delivery method for the data on Google spreadsheet. So this is a set of data points that you can download on Excel and check everything I'm about to talk to you about yourself. It is solely, as far as they allege, for the purpose of data acquisition. And if you actually look at their tools, I don't know if you guys can see this. So I'm going to go to tools, and let's go to database and name check, for example. Or even better, let's actually, can you guys see the change?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm trying to go to this one, I suppose. So in their tool function, you can submit corrections. You can actually search for things. For example, if we say name John, and this is if you don't download the data, you can actually find a hit of data points, usually having a picture, age, a description of the event. There's a unique ID. There's a location specified. There's a cause of death. And there's also, for every data point, a required news story to corroborate the event. And so with this data set, it was much easier for me to use the photos to copy and reverse image search the photos that were often the same photos used in the obituaries for the deceased. And so I was able to verify many more of these data points to actually be people that have died. And so to submit something to the system, I'm searching for the submission form. I'm trying to find where it is. I might just be a little lost because of the.
Hey, Christopher, for the sake of brevity, I think you've made the point that data acquisition can be problematic.
Well, I'd like to really show people,
Okay.
So
go ahead.
basically, you can download this onto Excel, and then they have a spreadsheet where you can literally classify and count with a search in Excel for that particular classification. And so the first thing I did is I searched for the states for the sample. And in doing so, I'd now like to stop screen sharing and first present to you guys just the results of if you take, so there are 28,439 data points. And the results of this, so let me just begin by sharing some simple results that you yourself can calculate, again, just by literally tabulating them in a search when you download it into Excel. So let's just do a screen share and application. Okay, you guys can see this Excel window.
Yes.
So one of the first things that's interesting is you see 6,052 African American or Black, Asian Pacific Islander, European American White, Hispanic Latino, Middle Eastern, Native American Alaskan, and then race unspecified. So the first concern is that we have 30.9% with no specificity as to race, right?
Yeah.
However, all right, now if we take this percentage, even though European American White is the greatest in number, if you divide that per capita in rate by the population at that time for that time, meaning this is a data sample across time. So if at a particular time in your Excel search at that time, you divide the population of this subgroup as defined at that time, you'll get these percentages, which are the percent, their average is basically representative of a ratio. So this is similar to what ProPublica's article was discussing. It's just taking an arbitrary quotient that is a comparative rate at a time in proportion to a population sample. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, I'm just going to scroll down now. These are the proportionality of each data sample from states. And if we look at this, most states are within a threshold, but then we have California at 4,556. And then Texas at 2,512. This is a serious problem because we have a huge partition of the data that is mostly leaning to only basically a handful of states. Because when you look away from Texas, we then go to, well, let's see, Florida and Georgia. So Florida, Georgia, California, and Texas are a huge partition of this data sample. And that's a problem because if you're making a national inference from a skewed sample, your data could be skewed in such a way that your inferences are, at least on a national level, really not tenable.
But also, isn't California the most heavily populated state in the Union?
No. All right, so there are two ways to classify. There's the Dominican Republic in terms of population density per square kilometer, and there is the amount of the population, which is something different. Mm-hmm. And neither of those correlate. So let's explain what we need to get something that's explanatory. What kind of correlations do we want? We want a set of parameters for which there exist positive correlation coefficients in positive orientation for a parameter t that is time, okay, that negatively correlate with the decrease of the metrized parameter we claim has an explanatory component. We need that to happen. Meaning, if we're looking at this, let's look at New Jersey. 512, or sorry, 14. So the amount of population alone doesn't seem to make sense that immediately. And so I've checked this data for about, I'd say 5 days, trying to find, I've checked crime rates, traffic density, population density, the amount of population. I've tracked crime rates, I've tracked poverty rates, homeless rates. The problem we keep running into is no one of those parameters explains why California is a huge, California, Texas, and the other aforementioned states are such a huge partition of that sample. Now, does that mean that there couldn't be something going on? No, it doesn't mean that. But it does point most likely to a skewed data sample. Again,
Well,
I don't know.
I mean, what it sounds like, because this is all the information that we got from Fatal Encounters, and I've looked into Fatal Encounters methodology, so I would postulate that it's more than likely there is more information coming out of these states for whatever reason. I don't know why that might be, if they have maybe mandatory reporting from law enforcement agencies in those states, or just like a better methodology when it comes to their news sources collecting that data. But Fatal Encounters is interested in everything. They're not like excluding data from other states in preference of those data sets, I assume.
But
So-
here's the point, okay? It is so the reason we like geographic relevancy, the reason we usually specify that is because if and when there is a phenomenon localized across space-time physically, when there is an event, a physical event, or a set of events that you can localize to a particular region, then you want to really look and hone in on that region so you can study that region and the parameters associated with it.
Mhm.
Okay, so in English, and Christopher, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at least one of the points here is that, one, we don't have uniform collection of data among states that would allow for a data set that we could study for inferences at a national level. And so we can look at state by state data, but
Yeah.
because data isn't collected in the same way in each state,
Mhm.
we don't have data that has a level of reliability that will allow for us to make inferences at the national level, given this subset of data, the subsets of data from each state. Is that?
Well, I would say technically we can make some inferences. For example, even if the data is skewed, if we can affirm beyond reasonable doubt that some subset of the data is like true beyond reasonable doubt, we can say at least this many people had this happen, right?
Well,
Right. So,
and
but this is the point. The point is that when you look up a source, statistics is not just about looking at someone's interpretation of the data, because it is not obvious in this case that if you do that with this data set, it's not clear that your sample is sufficiently unbiased that you can actually extrapolate something on a national level that has any semblance of traction.
yeah, and I think that's the important part. Is what this is challenging is those claims that like ProPublica made when it's like we divided basically the rate of black deaths and white deaths by the population, and we arrived
Yeah.
at this number. And it's like, if that's coming from this same source of data or a similar source of data,
now we see the
then-
problem, right?
yeah, it
And that's
means
why we
that
do not do that at institutional inference. So the point, Philosophy Queen, is we're linking this back to when they made that inference on the article on ProPublica, that study, okay, which was not peer reviewed. They handled some body of data, but doing the statistics is not just about monkeying through data points. You have to very carefully do a multi-dimensional analysis of the data points and check them for coherency, consistency. There's a reason you need a PhD to be a statistician. Okay.
I think clarification regarding the purpose of this discussion would be beneficial, and
Yeah.
and I think the purpose is that we believe, I hope I speak collectively for us, that policy could benefit from data-driven, scientifically based reasoning, and that in order to determine which policies would result in optimal results, we need to have legitimate, reliable, valid data to help inform said policies. And so having accurate data is critical if we want to advocate for data-driven policy and measurable outcomes. Is that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
I think that nails the point pretty well, because one of the issues that I take with the way this discussion is being handled at a broad societal level is that people identify problems by a set of very extreme cases that are not necessarily indicative of these systemic trends, but then they try and recommend or propose ideas to address those problems when those proposals are not backed by a lot of data. And so even if they were implemented, we would not be able to measure the success or failure of those proposals at achieving the goals that they were apparently designed to do.
Yeah, and so I think Sherry makes a good point. She says statistics can always be manipulated, and that is that's I think a prevalent problem that we face. When someone says unarmed Black men are more likely to be shot by police than unarmed white men, right? So that is a true statement. We can also say that more whites are killed by police than Blacks, right?
Yeah.
So those are both true statements, right? But it's the presentation of the data and that can skew the perception of reality, and also just as statistics themselves and the measurements that are used, of course, can be manipulated. And one of the things that Christopher and I discussed is that oftentimes people will find what they're looking for, and data can be manipulated to accommodate that.
Yeah. And so I don't know what is true about this because I'm relying on a body of data that a person has analyzed. And I usually like to check what people do with data. So I don't know what's going on, but I want to show that if we jump ship, let's try another dimension of analysis. A recent one claims about disproportionality insofar it relates to COVID, because I claim that this is actually going to also be telling. So I actually went to this website. It's an organization, and it's actually Johns Hopkins. Let's just pull it up. I'm going to screen share it. So I actually contacted the senior scientist of this website, and I've got the email, so I'll show all this. So let's just go ahead and application window. And
it might not be a good idea to show the email. I don't know if YouTube has restrictions against doxing.
Right. Well, basically, then I have no way to directly. Let me think. Well, there's. Let me think.
While you're thinking, let me add that in terms of getting data, so when it comes to public data, that data can be requested. So there's a process in academia one has to go through in order to get these raw data sets. And Christopher didn't have the opportunity to contact various organizations, to get that. But data should be available, the raw data.
So this
but there is a process, and there's a whole, there's an IRB process with each educational institution to go through as well when it comes to getting data, and then protections or precautions that it be used appropriately.
Yeah. So let me say this. I guess you'll have to take my word for it. I mean, it's right in here. I don't know if you guys can see, but this is the email. But all right. So this chart is taken from a data sample of Johns Hopkins University Center for Science and Engineering, which is supposed to be reputable. And the gentleman who actually wrote it, if I can, about us, experts, here we go. This is David C. Radley. He's the senior scientist tracking health system performance. This is the gentleman I actually sent an email to. Can you guys see when I pulled that up?
Yeah.
Okay. And he responded. I asked him, okay, can you give me your raw data, and can you discuss the methodology used to produce this graph? He happily obliged. Very nice guy. I guess you'll have to take my word for it. But anyway, from this, I will now click this email and open. So in the data set, you will see basically it partitions down to reports per capita. So let me just, I'll show you guys. It'd probably be more productive if I just pulled it up. Here we go. And is it open? Yes. All right.
I do
now I'm
not
going to
see
do a
it.
screen share.
Okay.
Give me a second. I'm hoping it's going to let me. Is this one?
Hi, Sarah. I meant to say hello earlier.
There we
Yeah,
go. Okay.
we'll get to your questions.
Yep. All right. So this is really impressive. Johns Hopkins University has actually done an outstanding job in collecting data on COVID-19. And as you can see, you can do all kinds of analysis with these data points with some margin of error, understandably. But so if we look at US, I don't know if you guys can see over here, deaths recovered. So deaths and recovered. So it's a comma separating them. So these are the deaths and these are the recovered. New York is number one. And you can partition these each based on category. And you can, from this click, let me just click. Okay, the screen share is probably not going to show it. So I gotta, let me open what it will prompt now. So let's just go ahead and open the result as reported by the government. So here we go. So this is included in this data sampling. And this is what I'd like to bring to people's attention. So let's just do another screen share, application window. Here it is. So this system relies on these individual data points. And if we actually look at them, let's go ahead and scroll down. You know, it basically shows Black, African-American majority, Hispanic, Latino, white, and Asian. But, and this is as reported NYC Health. And again, all links will be in the description. So now we read the fine print. It says right here, the vast majority of cases are reported by labs, and race/ethnicity information is often missing because it is not received on the test. Okay, and Hispanic Latino includes people of any race. So this is, even without checking geographical consistency, this is a problem. Because here we have Johns Hopkins caught up with this. And these are serious confounding things that to put in fine print.
Yeah.
And these are inferences on which people would extrapolate conclusions.
Did they provide?
I went into UNC and got tested. I can't speak for every city and every county. And there was no mention of my race. They literally just had me take the swab and take a sample, and then that was the end. So I'm not even sure how they got this data. You see, but there's no mention of a raw data sample. It's not peer reviewed. It's just.
Yeah, well, and that's what I was concerned about. Like, you said that on the Johns Hopkins website, the one where we had the map and the graphs and everything, that was the data that they were using. But is there any way to actually look at all of the individual data points? Do we know which ones they've collected a race data value for and where they came from?
They don't collect them all the same way as far as I'm aware. Some of them are individual and some of them are clustered. And because of that, but this is the biggest data sample, New York City. And I mean, look at this category. Hispanic, Latino can be any race. All that literally has to happen is some of these can be put here, and suddenly you've got a different story. And this is we don't even know geographically how this. It's the problem that I'm pointing towards is that when we analyze data, if we're not careful about how we actually check the data itself before trying to make an inference from it, we can draw inferences from that data that on its face seems substantive. It is at our peril that we handle data. It is not as easy as just looking at data points. That's the lesson here.
So yeah, and so I think you've clearly demonstrated that.
But we can go on and on.
Yeah,
But let's not. Let's. I think we're just
so I think you've given sufficient examples to demonstrate the problems with data. Sorry, Christopher, but before you got to make one of your points, looks like Sherry already did about the body cameras and the need for and the need for each officer to do that.
Is that Sherry? Sherry, there's a difference between measurement error and methodological error. Those are not the same thing. Categorically, that is not the same. The criticism isn't that there's measurement error, and if that's what you've inferred, I haven't explained it well. The problem is these are categorical mistakes that would never pass under the scrutiny of a scientific journal.
So I'm not sure she's speaking about in terms of statistical jargon.
Gotcha.
There.
Okay.
Right.
So just like the point in general, I suppose, is that it's harder than it may seem to make inferences from data. And if and when we read from a data source a stat, that doesn't necessarily mean that's even a statistic at all. In the sense that when we think of statistics, perhaps some subset of people think of something that's backed with scientific or mathematical rigor, right? There's some subset of people sometimes, if and when they use the word statistic, they kind of there seems to be a subset of people that think that to have some kind of substantiveness. That what I'm trying to say is it may not actually be true. It's actually very difficult to make a national inference from a body of data, especially when the data is new and gathered in a way that's not peer reviewed. Go ahead.
And I think another important point here, and which is kind of where we started, is where people get their information, right? And so when people are drawing conclusions or developing their perspectives, opinions, based on the information they consume via the media, they are, the majority of people, I would conjecture, are getting that from the mass media, right, and not from peer-reviewed scientific journals.
Right.
And so I think your point is made there that that these conclusions,
I claim that a lot of
the information
people
presented isn't often based on statistical rigor, right? In terms of data analysis.
Yeah.
Okay.
This leads me to a point that I've been trying to interject with, and sort of we've mentioned it before when we weren't recording, sort of things. That with the
Sarah,
with what Sarah is saying, and what you're also saying, Carla, it's like the data that people are getting to make the judgments on, often, as we were saying, from a source that may not, like, even if it's doing a credible search on something, it may be focusing on a small part of the problem when it's a much larger, more things need to be taken into consideration, other than just what has been mentioned, sort of things. And they do that as a sort of way to cherry pick, to supplement their point, sort of things. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
See, but this is the problem. Is it Sherry? Is we don't know. This is speculation. And that's the problem. Is we can speculate all day, not literally, about what this means. These data points are not the kind of data points that you would find in an accredited journal of science, where the method of data acquisition is very meticulously described. The process by which the data was analyzed, it's usually double blind. You don't have the people trying to make an inference, the people who gather the data. And that's not what all these notice that I chose the best data points I could find. We went to Johns Hopkins, and we still find a bevy of confounding problems. These are not small mistakes. These are, how did you miss this? These also,
are like you were saying before. Sorry, because my point was twofold, two-parted. When you said before about the when you had the stats and it showed that they had like Caucasian, African American, and then Hispanic, and it, like that was basically other, and they like if someone's half Caucasian and half African American, then where do they fall on that chart as well? You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
Like the actual sort of vagueness of what is race can actually sometimes
the
be a
definition of
problem.
race and how you collect that data. Is it something that was self-identified by the person involved in the case, or was it something that somebody looked at them and it's like, hey, you look black, and they just checked the box?
To be clear, I'm not saying that the absence of evidence implies that there's not a problem either. Okay, and I'm not saying the inability to gather data in a ideal manner precludes us necessarily from improving data acquisition. That's actually meant to both give people perspective that, wait a minute, if I read something, even if it comes from Johns Hopkins University, that doesn't mean that their inference is necessarily correct. I should ask or try to check and download the data for myself if I have the time. But the problem, of course, is that's not practical, and you maximize gains from trade based on usually specialization according to comparative advantage. You wouldn't,
So I think this is maybe a good time to segue into some of the questions that were posed earlier. Maybe we could start with Sarah's questions.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull up a video that she actually produced, and because I think we could keep going through each category that I selected, but I think we've gone on 45 minutes on this. The constraint at this point, at least one constraint would be time, but if existent. So let's see on.
If time even exists.
I can't believe we've gone 45 minutes with no mathematical equations. So
I mean, I've been trying to, believe it or not, I've been trying to keep it brief, and I've got so much to share, but we don't.
To be fair to Christopher, he has been like sort of studying it for a couple of weeks now, trying to get all the information. So he has poured through a lot.
I know he has. And with the best of intentions, I believe.
Yeah. I'm trying to find actually the best data I can, and this is, if anything, to motivate discussion of one. I want to motivate inquiry for people, but I also wish to I wish to motivate a discussion about how we can perhaps try to have better methods of data acquisition, if possible. Okay. So I'm going to screen share this now. And let me just pull this out separately.
I actually wrote down all the questions, if that would be easier. Okay.
Okay. I'm going to play this.
Can anybody hear anything? Because I cannot.
No volume. Here.
I'll fix it 1 second. To do that, I just have to click screen share, and then.
So is this just like a question that someone recorded on video and sent in for us to? Okay.
Yeah, and if anyone else in the wants to ask a question in the comments, then we'll be happy to
share audio. There we go. Okay. This should go well now.
Tape myself asking you guys 5 questions related to the topic at hand. So here they are. Number 1 would be, how would each of you define what racism is in a sentence?
So do you guys want to do this one question at a time?
Yeah, I reckon that'd probably be the best way to do it.
Maybe. Sure.
Yeah.
I can start, since I, in preparing for this, I wrote down a very brief definition for myself that isn't, this is not an academic definition, so this is just sort of how I would define it. And I defined it as a socially ascribed classification based on real or perceived physical characteristics, particularly skin color, and facial features that relate to social status.
Okay. What do you guys think?
I mean, in a sentence, I would just say that it's the perception of any inequity between people based primarily on features that can be attributed to race, stemming essentially from cultural heritage, like what a person's genetic background, I suppose.
Duncan?
Yeah, I would like sort of add that as well, that like sometimes it is a cultural thing, not like sometimes it is based on appearance and stuff like that, but it can take many forms. So I'd just say it's discrimination or towards people based on differences in culture, race. So basically, it's melding both your answers together, really. Yeah.
So yeah, I would argue. So I would argue that race, in itself, isn't racism, right? So though the two are, of course, intertwined, and also note that there's no biological basis for race. That those claims that were prevalent in throughout history have all been negated, and so there's no biological no biological basis for it. But I would argue that race is real because it's real in its consequences, right? And it's been used as a way to oppress various groups and allot privileges to others.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And well, I also think it's important to try and define race, and it's actually something that I came up against while attempting to answer this question, is that you can't just say that it's physical differences, because physical appearance or something that could include like weight, height, things that you don't typically associate with race. So it's a specific set of qualities of appearance by which this perception of inequity is distributed.
Yeah, and so I think from my knowledge, which is based on the research of other people, humanity as humans in their current manifestation is based in Africa, right? So we all humans all came out of Africa, and then with continental divide and all of that, there were adaptations based on proximity to the equator and diet. And so, just as other species adapt to their environments, so have humans. And so skin color, eye shape, etc., are a result of adaptations. And of course, you can see these pictures, right, where those adaptations aren't always consistent. But generally speaking, that is why we have those physical differences.
Right. So I actually met with 3 biologists, 2 anatomists, and I even talked to someone who was actually in UNC in the clinic when I went to get tested. And when scientists, specifically biologists, say there's no biological basis for race, what they mean isn't that these physical traits, as far as I'm aware, I don't think. Well, right, so it's not correct to say what a large set of people think, because I don't know. I claim that some non-empty subset of people probably are referring to observable traits, metrizable. And the problem we have is whether it be in terms of genealogy or genomic phenotypical expression results. These are twin sisters.
Mhm.
So what race are they? The problem
Yeah.
we have is you often run into situations that contradict one or the other, making the definition incoherent as a scientific method for classification.
Absolutely. And we've seen that society determines race, not biology, not,
Yeah.
the having sort of hard parameters to establish race. They're just as this photo demonstrates, you can always there's always going to be a fallacy there. So when we look back at Plessy versus Ferguson, and Plessy bought the ticket in the white section, right, and was told he couldn't ride in the white section because he was 1/8 Black, right? But because he had some physical attributes that
Yep.
he was considered Black,
Hmm.
that was it, right? And the same, like we call Barack Obama our first Black president. He has a what society has determined to be a Black father and white mother.
I'd
Right.
like to unpack that. I'd like to
And
unpack
so,
the philosophy behind it, because that's really what I've been waiting for.
like our nebulous, and not everyone can meet Leland.
Well,
there has to be queen. I agree.
Yeah.
We do. I do want to give respect to the people who have asked some questions, because we listened to the one from. I'm sorry, I already forgot her name.
Sarah.
Sarah,
Sarah, yeah, but I believe that there are some more. If we could just quickly run through them and try
Yeah,
not
yeah,
to go off
that's
on
fine.
too big of a tangent.
Yeah.
okay, so I'm going to screen share this again. The
And
next
I
question.
think one of the points here is that because race is so difficult to define, we then have difficulty defining racism, and then that leads to difficulty in terms of policy solutions. Yes, Sarah, we will get to the rest of the video.
Here we go. Okay.
You is, what has your personal experience with racism been? Like, how has it been, essentially?
Okay, so the second question, you guys want to go for it?
Yeah, right. I'm like white, so in a predominantly white country, so I don't actually get a lot of racism myself. But when I've traveled overseas, I have actually experienced occasionally a little bit of that. Because I live in Australia, it's a bit different over here, but we still obviously have racism and stuff like that. But it's not directed at me. But then when I went overseas to the Philippines, I sometimes got people sort of judging me with what they, how they referred, they were positive stereotyping or positive racism. Yep. So I got a bit of that over there and everything. Like, people assumed that I was rich and American and all that sort of stuff. And I was like, no, I'm actually a broke Australian.
They were disappointed when they found out you were Australian. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. But so yeah, I've experienced it, but not in the way that people often think of it as racism. You know what I mean? It wasn't hugely derogatory or anything like that, or like people weren't harassing me too much.
Yeah, I grew up in a town called Greensboro, North Carolina. Actually, Christopher, you're familiar, I assume.
I think so.
But there is a pretty significant racial disparity in Greensboro, just in terms of, like, if I were to estimate, because I don't have the census data, I've never bothered to look it up, like roughly half of the population is white and maybe over a third Black, and then other assorted minorities, Hispanic and Vietnamese and other things. So my experience with that has been, I've seen situations where certain geographical areas within the city are high poverty, high crime, and they also tend to be predominantly a single race, either Black or Hispanic or what. So there is that difference. And one time when I was out walking on the street, I was mugged by 3 Black youths. I think I was like 15 at the time, and they were maybe slightly older. So that's been my only real experience that I would say where race has played a significant factor in my thoughts about it, my opinions on it. But I myself have not really received much that I would say has been racially motivated.
So I could go on for a week probably about my experience with race, but I think the most important point that I could make would be that because of race and racism, I have been the recipient of great privilege due to my skin tone and physical characteristics. And what I mean by that is that because my parents, I'm so sorry. I can't do that right now. Yes, right foot. Thank you. Okay. Because my parents were not subject to redlining, they were able to get a home in the suburbs. And I was able to attend a nice suburban school with lots of resources. Because my parents were from a white heritage, they were able to accumulate wealth, which is generally passed from generation to generation, and therefore able to save money so that I was able to go to college and get an education. Because of my white privilege, I grew up with an expectation that college was not only reasonable, but also expected. I have been able to drive, and I've been pulled over more than a few times, which doesn't say a lot for my driving skills. But in those situations, I've been afraid. I've been afraid that my car insurance will go up, that I'll get a ticket. I've never been afraid that I would lose my life. And so, live your grace, please. And so, when I look at my experience with race, it would be that I have benefited. I'm so sorry. I'm going to mute myself in situations where others have not been able to do the same. I'm going to go on mute for a bit.
Okay.
That's okay. So I don't know what my experience has been in association with racism. And part of that is because I don't know what race is. And I don't know, therefore, what it means to be racist. And it's, I think I could make conjectures, but it would be disingenuous of me to say that there'd be anything deeper than that. And that's part of what I'm trying to motivate. And to be honest, what I went through, I don't consider a rigorous analysis of the data points that we discussed. But I was hoping to motivate in people curiosity to really investigate rather than assume that they understand something. And so I'd like to continue answering Sarah's questions, but actually I think I'd like to, we'll get through the questions, but let's try to answer them briefly, because what I want to get to is discussing the philosophy behind race as a concept.
There's also been other questions too that in the chat that I don't want to skip over.
Yeah. We'll just try. We're not going to try to take too terribly long on them, but it is important that we address them.
I'm more interested in quality than quantity, and I think the people watching would agree. I don't want to waste people's time, which maybe I already have. If time can be wasted, if existent, I don't know. But it's. I guess I'll play this and we can answer another question. So.
Number 3 would be, do you guys think that the U.S. has more of an issue with race/racism than other countries?
No. I think that one, well, if she comes back, that one would probably be a good one for Carla to answer on, like, just specifically, because as far as our
studied it.
opinions go, I mean, like racism might be an issue everywhere. It's something that's particular sometimes to its geography, to the differences in races that are present and how they're treated. But Carla, the question was, do you think that racism is a bigger or more pronounced issue in America than it is elsewhere in the world?
So yeah, and this is where if we could cue Sherry and Professor Khan, she may be able to provide more expertise.
If you want, I can drop her a link. She can click the link, and I can pull her into this discussion. Would you like that, Sherry?
Oh wait, she just says she has to go. She sent me a text. But so here's what I and I believe Sherry would agree with this, that racism I do believe is more of a problem in the United States. However, if we want to look globally, we see similar problems, but rather than being based on race, are more based on ethnicity. And there is a distinction there. And we see it particularly in Central Africa, Central African countries where there's a lot of ethnic genocide, and in India and other countries. I mean, and racism is a problem in Western European countries, but not, from my understanding, to the magnitude of what it is in the United States.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess we'll, just for brevity, go to the next question.
Yep.
Is that fine?
Yeah.
Yep.
Number 4 is, if race is a social construct, why does science say it's different or that it doesn't even exist?
I think we've kind of gone over that one already.
No, we haven't actually.
Well,
I've let you guys talk about that a lot, but I've got a lot to say on that.
Okay.
But I wonder, let's do the next question, because that will be, as far as I'm aware, the final question, and then we can dive into that. Is that fine?
Yeah, because I think that's going to be a bigger one.
Yeah.
Bigger answer. Yeah.
All right.
And lastly, number 5 is, what does the media have to say about racism? I know here in the US, race/racism are talked about at length, but it also depends on what kind of media platform you're viewing or listening to. And I wonder how it's like in other countries. Yeah, that's it. Those are my 5 questions, and I hope you guys get to at least answer 3 of them. But yeah.
So I think that it's an excellent question, and I'll just briefly say something in regards to it. One of the reasons that I went into the data, the subset of all the data that I've poured through over the past 3 weeks, as I did, which wasn't even that thoroughly, was really to motivate an understanding of like how to research data. And because I think some people think that research is just looking at an article, oh, it's an EDU or it's a Johns Hopkins or something, and that's okay. I have evidence now, and they have their facts, and then they argue with their facts in their paper. And what I'm hoping to motivate is you really have to not skip steps between the set of suppositions and the consequent you're trying to infer. That's the simplest, I guess, simplification, kind of redundant, and probably not even true. That's what I believe I'm trying to communicate. And insofar as that relates to Sarah's question, I think our awareness of that can change sometimes, in some non-empty subset of cases, I claim, our approach, in particular, our utility of language as well. And what I mean by that is sometimes I've noticed the media will use, wittingly or unwittingly, types of language that create the illusion of a specificity or substantiveness that isn't even there. When people read these articles, some non-empty subset, I claim, it seems that people are they have the illusion of a precision and rigor that isn't there. Like when we say the government, which branch? What subset of that branch? The judicial, the legislative? Who in that branch? Who in the judicial? What persons specifically? In what way? At what time? More we specify and concretize, the less nebulous and conspiratorial the theory has to become. Unless you're schizophrenic. I mean, technically, if you're neurotic, that's not true. You know, I mean, I'm not making a universally quantified claim here. I'm just, go ahead.
Well, but you do make a point there, particularly regarding the media, and there have been studies looking at offenders of crime, and in particular violent crime. And when the offender is white, the media doesn't ascribe any or label any kind of race. Whereas if the offender is Black, then the media is more likely to say a Black male. And that helps to perpetuate that myth of the violent Black male. And this is something that has been perpetuated and used as propaganda for quite some time. We can even, go back to the history of marijuana and the laws surrounding marijuana. And it goes back to basically a guy in a job who didn't have a whole lot to do and wanted to ensure job security. His name was Anslinger. And so he came up with this whole notion of marijuana being used primarily by Blacks and Mexicans, and it made them savage. And, went through this whole narrative of having to protect our white women from this violent, predatory Black male. And we needed to make marijuana illegal because of that. And so when it's just an example of our how our laws, our public policies are grounded in racism, and particularly with regard to our drug laws that aren't developed on the basis of any kind of scientific regard for the pharmacological effects of drugs, but rather on the social narrative that is presented by those who are in positions of power. Went off on a big tangent there.
It's okay. It comes with the territory,
Oh, and Simon asked a question earlier too that we didn't get to, and that was why is this so important?
Well, that probably that probably depended on where in the video that question was asked as to what exactly was being talked about. Race. Oh,
yeah.
Defining race. Okay.
So the definition is very important because for at least one reason, I claim, and one of those reasons is that to say that we have an instantiation of racism is to say that race, that there is some relation between this phenomenon that we call racism and the concept of race. And it's not obvious necessarily that the definition of race can be biconditionally related to, therefore, our classification of instantiations of racism. So let's say if we take the tendency of brains, as far as we're aware in neuroscience, to some degree form pattern recognition in association with external data points, and from that pattern recognition produce a bevy of expectations. So I think I have an expectation, as far as I'm aware, that when I drop this pen, it behaves in a particular way, and I think that's not even on a cognitive level, perhaps, but on a, I don't even know if it's subconscious, because I'm not a neurologist. I don't know the neuropsychology or anything like that, or the neurochemistry, but some phenomenon is happening.
Christopher, you're I think departing a little bit.
No, I'm not. It's as far as I'm aware, these things are intimately connected. The point that I'm trying to articulate is I'm trying to think about it, like make it more concise without compromising the substantiveness. How about this? I'll let you guys talk, and I will try to condense what I'm trying to say so that it's not
Okay.
like 3 minutes
Yeah.
long.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as you do that, I wanted to look at Philosophy Queen's question. But what specific law is now actively practicing racism? And in response to that, we can look at the laws regarding crack cocaine and powder cocaine.
Yeah.
This is something that has improved, but in recent history, a person who had 50 grams of crack cocaine, which it would be considered the street drug, more of a black person's drug because it's cheaper, would receive the same punishment as someone with 5,000 grams of powder cocaine, which is considered a white person's drug. So President Obama worked to change the disparity in the sentencing there and significantly reduce the ratio, though it still is disproportionate. But that is
That's specific law. But
So-
and it's not just as specific laws sometimes, but it's also the ways that some of the laws are enforced is also
absolutely.
So I think I've like reduced what I want to say sufficiently to make it concise. What I'm trying to say is if you take just brain functioning, all right, the tendency of a brain to have pattern recognition and from that formulate hypotheses or expectations, not even on a conscious level. If you define racism to be any instantiation of such a formulation on the basis of whatever you define phenotypical traits relevant to race to be, then you have a problem of then racism is literally systemic to how your brain works. And you've got a movement without a possible resolution unless people change neurochemically. The definition informs the instantiations of racism.
Yeah. Okay. So to maybe bring that into some English, the problem that you encounter when you don't have a defined term, or like when you don't have a sufficiently rigorous definition, is that when you try and make these sorts of policy decisions or try and collect data on that point, you have to answer the question, what is race? For a lot of people, it's just like they think that, well, I don't need to define what race is. I look at him and I see that he's black, but that's not really an adequate way of being about things if you want to collect data and you want to actually propose workable social solutions.
Yeah,
It's
I
kind of
want to
like
make a remark.
pornography. One of the Supreme Court justices in dealing with a case on pornography said, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, which makes any type of measurement or policy very, very difficult. And
Yeah, we'll run everything by him. If he
Right.
says it's pornography, then that's there it
So
is.
I want to point out something that's been
the
said.
ambiguity is problematic when it comes to trying to develop any kind of policy initiatives or reform that are data driven, which I argue would be important for optimal results.
Yeah. I think there's something important that's been brought up that should be addressed, which is there's been a lot of discussion of disproportionality. And I want to address that mathematically, really quick and very simply, because this is actually very important. Okay, there's a problem we have that's not obvious until someone ruminates. Let's say that over here is some process by whatever means we sample 100% for whatever arbitrary classification we've imposed equally, meaning R1 and R2. So R1 equals R2. Suppose that the rate of acquisition of that phenomenon or the rate of instantiation is the same, right? The problem we have is this. If these population samples grow at different rates, that will necessarily be disproportionate. Even if you sample that phenomenon equally in number. Does everyone understand? Not literally everyone, but those. We have a problem because what this means mathematically and logically is that disproportionality doesn't even logically necessarily imply that the phenomenon happening happens at a different rate. if these populations are different sizes or grow at different rates, and these phenomenon, even if they happened at the same rate, I'm not saying they do, or I'm not making any particular claims to any body of data. I'm just pointing out, even if we did make it to where those things happen at the same rate, if these population samples, however we classify and subdivide them and partition accordingly, if they grow at different rates or are different amounts, you will necessarily have mathematically a disproportion. And that's a problem, because then if you're arguing simply from the supposition that a disproportion may imply some problem, I'm not saying anyone has said that or that people argue that. I'm just saying that would be one possible issue that further muddies the water here. And also, which is worse, that 1% of 1,000, 1% of 50 people die, or let's say this: what's worse, that 20% of 50 people die, or that 90% of 1,000? Because another problem we have is when we look at statistics versus numbers, it's different, and it's fundamentally different insofar as if matter is quantized and there's a relation between whatever a person is and the matter, and the matter that I think encompasses me, if matter is quantized, then that's a countable array, which means you've got a countable a sample, and so it muddies the waters even further then, because you're talking about a countable sample. Does everyone see why that's relevant? Because then because the percentages are not. It may be 90%, but it's of 1,000 people. So which is more important philosophically? Is it better, as I said, that we worry about the proportionality and the percentages, which can arbitrarily be changed categorically by what we control for, what traits we select for, right? As far as I'm aware.
Christopher, don't take this the wrong way, but I think that the way that you've presented this idea and the way that you've talked about ideas which you clearly have spent some time thinking about, but we and the other viewers of the stream have not had that much opportunity to interact with, has left the last several minutes of your presentation more confusing than helpful.
Oh, man. Basically, if you've got two groups of people and they're different sizes, right? If I take one person from each group, that's a different percentage.
Yeah.
Correct. Right.
That's the problem. And when you muddy the water with that, in addition to the philosophical question of which is more important, that the same percentage of people die, if and when they're a different size, that could mean more people dying. You see, it's not clear. We often have the illusion of simplicity sometimes. And sometimes what philosophy is about is motivating questions it didn't necessarily occur to us needed to be asked. For example, what I want to get into is, what is race? What is the nature of the existence of race?
Yeah.
Well,
I want to respond to Philosophy Queen briefly, if I may, about if you affected based on people's economic status, not race. Yes and no. And I say that because, one, people of color are far more likely to experience poverty. And I would argue that that is a direct result of policy that has perpetuated cycles of poverty, particularly among people of color, including limited abilities to amass wealth. And then I would also argue that the geographic concentrations of minorities and the policing of those communities, particularly in an effort to enforce drug policy, has been race-based.
Yeah, I think
See, I don't know because I've looked at the statistics behind each. I've looked at the data behind each of the statistics that I'm aware of, the body statistics that you would cite. You're talking about like data samples taken from the Bureau as reported by the government, correct? The Bureau of Justice, for example.
Yep.
Yeah. And it's difficult to really make It's not that the data is completely incoherent. It's just what we have to be very careful with what we can extrapolate from it. If we're trying to really be,
I agree. But I'll also say that it's not in the government. I mean, if we want to look at motivation behind data, it's not in the government's best interest to present data that demonstrates racism.
Yeah.
well, I don't see how it does. And I want to be clear about this.
So I think a good example of this is education. Like when you get schools in certain neighborhoods, they don't get the funding. That hinders the children of those neighborhoods, putting them into a cycle of that sort of things. And it's sort of, that is a more quantifiable, like objective thing that we can see, oh yeah, that's happened, and it's happened throughout history sort of things.
Right.
But yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, and poverty is the number one predictor of crime.
See, but here's
Exactly
the problem
right.
with all this, okay? Even if we have all these, even if we grant a factor of a relationship in some correlation, that doesn't give us logically what we're trying to argue unless we have literally a plethora of separate dimensions of analysis that we can link together with positive, sufficiently statistically significant correlation coefficients that orientate in a positive direction with increasing parameter t of time, right? And that also corroborate if and when there's the absence of those parameters with a negative correlation coefficient. It's much harder than just to say, hey, look, these things happen. That's like, all right, so for example, overwhelmingly, the majority of people who are killed by officers, which people can check in the data, as we showed, which will be provided in the link, are men, overwhelmingly. Does that mean that, therefore, that implies that police are sexist pigs who hate men? No, it doesn't necessarily imply that. But it's the same problem. It's an extrapolation with so many underlying assumptions that it's overwhelming as to where to begin.
Okay, yeah. So I concede your point.
And again, that's not to say that doesn't mean that it couldn't be happening either. I don't know. I want to make that clear. I don't know.
Right. And just in case anyone out there who's viewing is questioning Christopher's motives or humanity or anything like that, he's a very data-driven, scientifically thinking person. And so it's not that he doesn't believe that racism is a problem, but rather that any scientifically legitimate response to addressing it should meet a level of rigor, right? Fair enough?
It's difficult to solve a problem that you don't understand.
Right.
And sometimes the reasons for which things occur are counterintuitive, if and when there's a reason. You know, and
I do want to point to North Carolina's voter ID law. As an example of a clearly a policy that has that was formulated with racist intent. And so the North Carolina legislature at the time had a Republican supermajority, which means that Republicans had large enough numbers in both the North Carolina House and Senate that they could override any gubernatorial veto. And they crafted a law that limited early voting, required voter identification, and there were some other components of that as well. North Carolina was allowed to do this as a result of a Supreme Court ruling in Shelby County versus Harding that prior to this, there were southern states that were not allowed to change their voting laws without consent because the Justice Department had basically because of the history of Jim Crow and voter suppression policies, the grandfather clause, poll taxes, literacy tests, those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And so with that Supreme Court ruling, I believe that was in 2012, these southern states were, then basically were granted permission to change their voting laws. And so we've since seen the emergence of states that have passed these voter ID laws. So the reason why North Carolina's was struck down by the courts is because the Republican legislature had race data in hand, and they specifically looked at minority voters and their voting patterns, their voting tendencies, and saw that, one, they engage in higher levels of early voting and are less likely to have government-issued identification, and crafted the law specifically to suppress minority votes. Mm-hmm. And so the court said that this law was crafted with racist intent, and the court said, the quote from the court was, with almost surgical precision. And so there's a very specific example of a current attempt to disenfranchise Black voters.
See, I can't affirm what you're saying, but I also I need to study it. I need to research it for weeks, probably.
Yeah, well, and that's fair, but that's also a case where the validity of the data that they had doesn't even matter if the courts could demonstrate clear intent to use that data in a way to suppress a specific population.
I don't know.
They have ruled some of these things because, like, the Republicans are quite keen on voter suppression, and they like to try it in a few different ways. There has been some things that haven't got through and stuff. Nowadays, because of the way things are, you can't pass a law that says make sure you give African Americans twice as long in the summer, because that's just not going to pass. But there are ways to be more subtle with language that makes it so that you can then implement something in a way that it does directly affect them, and that's things that have, as been pointed out, has been taken to court over and things, and sometimes gets through, sometimes doesn't.
But do you guys see the difference between this kind of discussion and what we were doing in the very beginning? One of those is actually substantive data from which we can try to argue some tenable, and the rest is speculative. And it would take me so many weeks to even try to tell someone.
Speculative if you look at court records.
I don't think it's that simple because I just showed you John Hopkins' webpage for a data sample that we would assume is coherent, right? And then when we check one of the links for New York in the fine print, we see that there's a repository of confounding variables.
Well, we could definitely have, and like you're saying, you might take weeks looking into these court cases to try and determine the validity of the conclusions that they came to.
I don't know.
But the thing is that at a certain point, our interactions in life become speculative. They cannot all be rigorous because we're not machines.
Right.
So
I'm not expecting like 5 standard deviations of confidence interval like in particle physics. I promise you that if you actually look at most accredited science journals, even in the social sciences, it's night and day. It's peer reviewed. They always post the raw data.
Can you recommend some journals or specifically some articles maybe dealing with race issues that we might look up for further reading?
I'd have to research and investigate. I don't know. And I'm sorry to say that, and by the way, my saying I don't know, Carla, I'm not saying you're wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, I know you well enough to know that.
Yeah.
REI is good. That's the Racial Equity Institute. They've got there are a wealth of resources there, and I'm not sure how readily available the raw data is, though I would suspect that you could request it.
Here's a question, and this
I do believe they're fairly transparent in their methods for acquiring data.
Right. So here's the question that I really wanted to motivate for a while, because I've really enjoyed, I think, talking with you guys. But this question I find interesting. if there's no biological basis for the concept of race, meaning it's not a scientific method of classification for a plethora of reasons. Which isn't to say there isn't a science to the perhaps even the social psychology or there may be an implicit relation, but it's not a category used by scientists as far as I've been able to affirm. The question I would have is this: can I change my race? And I have a series of questions. This is the first question, because I want to motivate a question that this will lead to.
Okay, well, it's an important thing to really consider, because like we were talking about before, some people treat race as though it's a thing that you don't even have to bother defining. You kind of look at a person, or maybe you listen to how they talk, and you're like, oh, you're black, or you're Indian, or you're from somewhere in Asia, and they assign that race thing. It's something that people, observers on the outside, assign to you based on those expressed traits. But if you're recording race for the purposes of law enforcement, trying to record the races of individuals that are involved, and say one of them is dead, what do you do there? Does the law enforcement officer get to decide based on their perceptions what race this person was? Or is it something that necessarily has to be self-identified?
Right.
And if it's self-identified, then the answer to your question, would be yes.
So let's say that other people, let's say that is a relation between myself and others, and let's leave it purposely nebulous, because we don't want to. In further concretization, we might make hidden assumptions that aren't obvious. So let's just conjecture that if there's some relation between myself and other applicable entities that defines race. My question is this: if other people determine it, how do I know what race I have?
Society tells you what your race is.
But how do I know?
Let me give you an example. So in early American history, Italians were not considered white. Irish were not considered white, right? Because society determined that they were not. Today, they are white. And so...
But here's Carla.
An Italian couldn't say I'm white. I mean, they could say it all they wanted to, but society wouldn't accept them as that. So,
right. But here's what I'm trying to say. This is my point. Do you notice that there's an illusion of precision in your use of the word society? Because as soon as I ask you, they don't know what everybody is thinking at all times T, which means they have a subset of a sample that they believe they perceive.
Yeah,
so my question is, how do I know what my race really is if it's a relation between the perception of some body of people that I may or may not be able to?
I think that boils down to the narrative that is transmitted by people in positions of power, the people who control the narrative that society adopts.
Okay, so are these people, when we say power, is it a function of numbers or is it a function of influence?
No. Influence.
Well, here's why. Because if it's a function of numbers, either way, because influence would imply we don't need as big a number per se, right? Meaning there may not be a relation either way. But if we argue that a single person could, not literally, but some subset of people would be sufficient, I claim that if thinking is finite, we could actually show that we could put an upper bound, perhaps, by principles of physics and neurochemistry on what they could think, and thus how many people they could be thinking of at any one time, from which we could infer that it may be difficult for you to actually have a relation of that sort with them. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
I think
go ahead, Alan.
I understand what you're saying. I don't think that what you're saying is necessarily as relevant to the conversation as you might imagine it to be.
I think it is, because it points to the ontology of race. You see, because it's not clear to me, if getting more precise, I suppose, let me just, I'll show you why I believe it's relevant. And then if this doesn't make it seem relevant, then I concede. But the reason that I believe this is relevant, is as follows. Because let's say that
I knew it was coming. I knew it was coming.
Was your whiteboard still tingling?
Do your psi and pi and cosine.
I promise I'll keep it short. So fix a reference frame F, and for an applicable entity in that reference frame, define a distance d such that d is the speed that light would travel in some time t, okay, in all directions in that reference frame. Here's my question. Any entity outside of this distance d on a macroscopic scale, right? It's hard to argue that if light is one of the fastest messengers, and that due to interference, we're not too worried about quantum entanglement.
You have created a small model of the observable universe and are saying that there is no causative relation between phenomena that occur.
It takes time for a causation, relations of causation to occur. So here's the point. If it takes time for causal relations to occur, and if and when my race is a function of some relation between myself and other applicable entities in a system that is instantiated in a physical space-time, then the ontological implication is that the nature of the existence of race has gaps.
Well, yes, but do you recognize,
unless it exists independent of thinking?
Do you recognize though that the example that you've drawn, it's like where we're talking about race as a social thing that is rooted mainly in years of progressive culture. It's not really a thing that just happens at any point in time. It's something that is in place because of social mechanisms that have themselves been in place for hundreds of years. That's true. And but you are trying to draw its physical limits by making an analogy to the observable universe, saying that if somebody on the outside of the observable universe believes you to be a certain race, how could they have that type of causative relationship? And I don't
determine your race.
I don't think that is really relevant at all.
I think it is
to the core.
What does it mean to say?
Hold on, I'm gonna go bang my head against the wall for a few hours.
You have fun.
Well, here's the point. Okay, what does it say that I have this race? If there is a time interval over which it's not well defined, does it exist mind dependently or not? Is my question. One of my questions.
I think that the quality of race, as with many other things on a social level, is an emergent property of other aspects of culture. And when we're talking about culture, we're necessarily including parameters like geographical proximity and like the years of time over which that proximity has been established.
Right.
And
but here's the point. We can set different observers. The speed of light was an arbitrary example just to make a point. We could choose a rate r at which this could propagate, geographically spread people out, and actually get conflicting definitions across time as we follow the arrow of causation. Not that there's not a theory of causation, but if general and special relativity as we understand are correct, just the satisfaction of those conditionals across a parameter t, that we don't have to concede time is real, just a parameter that coincides with the propagation of states.
Only
I
you
don't know if
out of
my sound effects, but they seem like to go well. Ricardo, I would argue that he does know that there's a real world out there. And to Christopher's credit, his approach is to his goal is to come up with solutions to problems that are based on statistical rigor.
Well, it's this kind of math and science stuff, but I'm like, only you, Christopher, of all the people that I have ever had the pleasure of meeting on this earth, would ever try to argue race on the level of quantum physics.
No, I'm not. I
was going to go the other direction and say it's a bit like art.
I didn't discuss quantum mechanics. I did not discuss quantum mechanics.
You mentioned special relativity.
That's not quantum mechanics. I was just making a confession about interference. Basically, I was trying to address non-locality insofar as it relates to issues of causation. But all I'm trying to say is if you think about it ontologically, the reason I think it's relevant, okay, is because if it's not clear how it fundamentally exists, okay, then it's not clear to me.
So the philosophical.
What does it mean to say I have a race?
I understand. Yeah. Duncan, go ahead.
I just had a mathematical thing to say about the whole thing. It's like it does seem to be a bit like art. Like, what is art? We don't have a definition of art, yet we have a societal agreement on what art is. Yet art is individual to each person as well.
Do we
So
have
it's
an
like
agreement, or do we have like individual assumptions that other
Yeah,
people
so it's
agree?
like we have the
We have museums that have art in it, so there is
Yeah, well,
obviously
it's there is some level of agreement. Like some other people might agree with you in certain cases when you say that a certain thing is art or that a certain person has a certain race, but it's this
Mhm.
assumption that we have, which is actually key to the whole idea. The assumption that we have as individuals that large portions of society agree with us. And that allows us to kind of engage in these behaviors as
and
though
justify.
as though it's an established thing. It's
That's
like
my question. Basically, is if we want to solve a problem, right? We want to make a distinction just in studying the thing between a fundamentally existent thing and a referentially existent thing philosophically, because otherwise I can replace safely the word "tug" with race, and I can say you're a Tugist. And
All right, we're not going into tugs and boogs and schmoogs. And...
but I guess what I'm saying is I wish to motivate a discussion that orients us towards better data acquisition and a concretization of definitions that would allow us to propose tenable policy. And I'm not convinced that from what I've excavated thus far, the foundation is sufficiently robust and the philosophy is sufficiently coherent for that to be tenable. Which means,
you see, that is a nice statement. The part that I think confounds and confabulates is when you try and represent that idea by approaching it from this angle of like small particles and observers and the mathematical relationships or non-relationships that they have. That's the part where you lose people.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And if I had to summarize what I'd say, I honestly don't know. I don't know what's going on. And I don't mean
Yes, there you go.
I don't mean that to say that I'm not saying I'm neurotic and schizophrenic, but I mean fundamentally, if I'm trying to prove with certitude a propositional truth claim, I don't know. And yeah, there it is. It's conjecture that I hope to just motivate questions, but it's a concern for me because if it doesn't fundamentally exist, for all we know, we're stirring a pot with no foreseeable solution.
And I think, I mean, I've been laughing and joking, but I do think that there is benefit in scientific in scientific rigor with regard to approaches to solving community and societal problems. And we can look throughout history and see that policy is crafted many times without regard to rational, logical, scientific data.
And you see the concern, because even if the data acquisition is spot on, if the philosophy is bullshit, you're fucked.
Well, and I appreciate that too, but there's a point at which pragmatism has to come into play.
And by the way, I say that as conjecture. I don't know.
When we're having these discussions, it is important to be pragmatic because maybe you can prove or disprove some idea on the level of very rigorous mathematical logic, but nevertheless, if the idea that you're attempting to prove or disprove does not, in that proof, remove the problem that we're trying to address with the conversation, then I don't think it's really relevant to the discussion, because
I don't know.
it
don't
hasn't
know.
changed the thing that it hasn't changed our goal in any meaningful way.
Well, yes, in a way, I claim it has, because now we question whether or not the thing we purport to be a goal, and sometimes in asking what a thing is and if it exists, sometimes you can find that can lead to counterintuitive discoveries.
And I do acknowledge that, and I do understand what you're getting at, but I also don't want you to continue with the idea that because of this line of thinking, you can propagate a new idea that, oh, I guess race and racism was just never a problem to begin with.
I didn't say that.
I know that you didn't say that, but
I'm saying I
that's
don't
the
know.
thing.
Extrapolated,
As long as the ideas of race and racism continue to be a part of this large social discussion, the social narrative, and as long as there continue to be perceptions of problems that hinge on those factors, we can't reasonably go with this idea that, well, I guess they're just not really worth bothering about. They're
That's
not
not
really
what
I don't think
problems.
that's what he's saying at all. And
No.
and Alan, I'm not saying that that's what you're saying he's saying. But
Okay.
That's a good one.
We've departed.
That's like
We've
the I don't
departed
know. I
various
don't know.
ones.
That's the,
yeah, but what one point I do want to make is that right now we are dealing with such divisive tensions and issues surrounding race and racism, and we are seeing movements across the nation that are focused on racism. But what is the goal, right? So what, one example I think about historically is the Montgomery bus boycott, right? There was a specific problem, an identifiable problem. And then there was a goal that the people involved in the movement were working towards, which was the desegregation of the buses, right? There was a very clear course of action, and then the goal was achieved, right? And so when we look now and we just see, okay, our problem is racism, and it is such it's just such a huge issue, right? And so when we want to engage in activism or advocate for policy change, what specifically do we want to see changed, and what change, how are we going to measure progress toward our goal? And I think that goes back to, am I pointing? Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Duncan had his finger up near the camera like ET.
Oh.
So I
We're
was just
listening.
gonna.
We're listening.
But that's where we get to. Okay, that's where we get to. I think some of the relevance of Christopher's points is that how can we work toward improvement if we can't identify goals and measure progress?
And
get the actual root of the problem.
It is important. It's important to define the terms, define the problems that you're attempting to address. But let me
ask you a question, Alan. If you don't have a good definition for some term, right? How then do you identify instances of that term?
Yeah, and it's an important point.
And I also want to,
Can I help Alan out for a second?
Yes,
right?
please.
I don't mean no offense to America at the moment, right? Okay, but you guys have a house that's on fire, right? And he's saying like we need to throw water, buckets of water onto the thing, as opposed to like figuring out the precise definition of water. Maybe there's time for debate about the nature of water, and there's time to put fires out. And I get
But
that.
I think part of that discussion, Duncan, I claim, is for people to understand that maybe they don't understand.
Yeah,
I agree. both very good
It
points.
is important. It's just like one of the things where I kind of depart from Christopher is Christopher wants to be very careful with how he phrases things, with how he expresses his ideas, and very careful to make it clear all the time that he doesn't know. And on some level that is appreciable, but on the other level, you have to stop not knowing and do something practical if your goal is to be of any practical benefit.
To that point, Alan, I just ask you the same question. How are you going to do anything practical if you have a nebulous definition with which you can't identify instantiations of the claim?
No, and
I claim in the interest of practicality. Okay, this sounds hypothetical. I understand that. But I claim in the interest of practicality, this discussion is perhaps not for all people because it's possibly Pareto distributed. You know, that's the counterintuitive part. It's possibly we would not want to eradicate all
We're going to talk
instances.
about Pareto optimality. Oh, geez.
But just hear me out. I claim that if there was some subset of racism, which I think there is, it may not even work out mathematically to where the marginal benefit of its complete eradication is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. In other words, it may not even follow that we want to remove all of it. And that's counterintuitive.
No, I understand and I appreciate that, but it also seems like every time that we try to propose an idea, you come back to the point that you don't know.
Yeah.
And it's like,
but
okay, if we continue to cycle like that forever, then we will arrive at no practical benefit.
I don't mean that in the nihilistic way. Okay, I mean that I'm not sure. I'm not certain. I don't mean that as like nihilistic, like, well, we can't know, man. You know, that's not what I mean. I'm not. I mean as a concession.
Or you think you mean?
I think that I
Sometimes you're aware.
But it's I believe in.
You think you believe. You
right.
can't be certain.
Right.
Don't encourage it.
But you see, but I don't even know if that's right. I mean, I don't. You know, it
Right,
may
you
be
don't know.
easier.
You don't
It
know.
may be easier if I just. But again, when I say, as far as I'm aware, that I don't know, I'm not. I don't mean it to be what I think it could be perceived as.
Okay.
You know, I'm interested. Go ahead.
I think what the thing is like people think sometimes that you're deliberately trying to do this to, like, you know, cause confusion or something like that sometimes or whatever. But it's not. It's like what people like. Everyone's got a brain that works in different ways, and you know, Car?
Ricardo, go ahead.
Yeah, you said it just before about like Chris has got a mind that works in a very unusual way.
Yes, you can ask your question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to come into chat and actually ask it vocally?
Yeah.
Well, I
Bring it
mean,
in.
it's just something that it's like asking permission to ask a question. Just ask the question. You know.
Well, it's strange because you asked the question, right?
Was the question is that like?
Right.
Can I ask the question?
Ricardo, ignore them.
Okay.
But it's I believe that I'm an advocate for pragmatism, but I also don't know if it's enough to appeal to pragmatism. You see, it's because it's not always clear.
Just made the point, right? Most people are not trained to think logically or philosophically, and right.
No, I'm not.
No.
Not that I'm aware of. No.
That's unrelated.
Okay. But yeah, and it's not that any of the things that you've said are necessarily invalid, but it does make it difficult to have this kind of conversation when it feels like, at least based
when we have fucking standards, basically.
well, it's when you have but it feels like based on your actions that nothing is ever enough to meet those standards.
That might be true. You know,
what would it take for you to know something?
Well, I can promise you this, Alan.
Oh, that's a great question.
The data
That's
points.
a whole other episode.
Well, let me. All right. So the data points that I did present to you and discuss with you are far beneath what I'm used to in terms of like, you know, in physics, we are far more thorough about how we handle data. We have to be, you know, and to be honest, it may not seem like it, but I've been very generous with my interpretation and handling of that data. We didn't even get into the multivariable analysis, the differential equation. We didn't even.
And I thank you for that.
Right, but
you know, one point I think that's worth making is, you know, when we look at the soft sciences, you know, social sciences versus the hard sciences, and there are different methods, right? I mean, when you're doing mathematical equations, there isn't the same type of human data gathering on subjective, oftentimes subjective.
Well,
Yeah,
it's because
rocket
we
It's not as subjective, right?
yeah,
So,
well, it's because we have these things that are nebulous in their constitution, vague in their definition, and potentially different people will apply different definitions to them. You don't have that in the realm of the physical sciences, because
right.
necessarily everything in the physical sciences is rooted in those very structured, very rigorous definitions. But the social sciences is kind of, it's working backwards from our perceptions, which themselves involve various assumptions, and they're not so well defined or so well coordinated. But it doesn't mean that they aren't important.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I
that's
also
to be
think
clear.
that from a policy, you know, from a policy perspective, I do see the benefit of the statistical rigor that's used in the hard sciences.
To the point where the margin. Go ahead.
You know, to inform on creating optimal social public policy that deals with these sorts of issues, and of course it can't be perfect, because it is, you know, we are humans. We are going to make human mistakes. There are going to be subjective observations.
And to be clear, I'm not requiring that the data be anywhere near perfect.
Right.
The things I pointed out are not small oops, they're what the fuck, okay? They're not...
yeah, this is true. Remember when you were pointing out about the...
And I didn't even have time to go through it all. You know, I had so much data to pour through.
But I think, like, in that respect, and I'm sorry to keep cutting you off, Duncan, but it's because you're Australian. But the thing...
I did exist.
The thing that we arrive at is that, okay, we can't have perfect, scientifically rigorous data all the time, if at all, when we're dealing with these types of social concepts. So that's off the table. What can we do anyway to try and make that data better?
What can we do with what we got?
I claim that...
I think uniform methods of collection would be a good start.
It is a great idea.
I claim that motivating discussion also about the underlying philosophy, as well as better methods of data acquisition, are very important, because sometimes people use words and don't know what they mean by the words they use, or have the illusion of understanding something simply because they've referred to it.
Well, and that's also, it's the same issue that we come at, that we were just discussing, is that we have a kind of ingrained method of making assumptions that other people are going to understand what we say in the way that we intended it, or that what other people have said means what we've interpreted it to mean. And it's the same underlying problem with race and racism. We have these assumptions of an establishment that acts in such a way that it disadvantages some people and advantages others. And because several of us operate with those assumptions, it ends up allowing for the emergence of those qualities in our society.
I don't think he's saying that. I go with that one.
the example that you gave, I think when we were off stream one time, was that if everybody just woke up and had no memories,
Would we rediscover race? Yeah.
Yeah, would race and racism be applied the same way?
Mhm.
I think maybe over time, because that's kind of how they emerged initially anyway, was our awareness of these differences and our tribalistic behaviors, and that over the course of several thousand years became what we refer to as racism today. But in the absence of those collective social assumptions, we no longer have the social structure that we're arguing about, that we're attempting to identify and combat.
So I guess to make this like constructive, and we'll probably wrap up in like 20, 15 minutes. Insofar as like, is there any way we could try to concretize what race is in a way that would make classification less nebulous? Because the concern is this: even if we try to have better methods of data acquisition, if we're beholden to whatever person is defining the category to be what it is, and I don't mean that as an ultimate statement about free will or choice. I don't know, but there's the concern of a logical inconsistency in the definition between
right,
data sets.
I think that is that's really difficult, because race, right? The definition of race has changed over time.
Yeah.
Right.
The definition, even using, if we look at current day definitions about race, then the way it has been assigned historically would who would be what race would vary. So I think that's problematic, particularly in terms of longitudinal data. But I also think that there is, this is where the hard sciences and soft sciences differ, and that is where I do think there's value for qualitative data in this discussion and in policy resolution, and people's lived experiences with issues surrounding race and racism. And that's something where,
I've got a question. So suppose that, I'm going to conjecture you already have an inkling where I'm going with this, but suppose I don't know your lived experience. Do you know mine? Because if none of us know each other's lived experience, how can we then extrapolate from our lived experience a body of data points from which we can make an inference about how society should pass policy? It's not that it couldn't be done, but it would be with trepidation that we argue from that supposition, possibly, right? It would be difficult to argue from the supposition that you don't know my lived experience, that I can make an inference about how society is and should be structured. Unless somehow I argue that you don't know mine, but I somehow know yours.
Would it be fair to recap like some of the points that you've made about the data, Christopher, in regards? So one of the things that you pointed out was the I've forgotten the name of the university page that you had. It wasn't actually like don't even know what type of page it was now, but it had links to itself. You know what I mean? So it was yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So
the Dothraki, it is known.
Exactly right. So that's one thing you got to check, like where the sources are citing, and if they say this is right because I said so, then check again maybe. But the other one,
well,
hang on, there's three. There's the definitions of actually understanding what it is, and also something that like I fall victim to occasionally myself is when you see statistics and things like that. Because I'm not an actual statistician or whatever they're called, I sometimes don't get the complete picture, and the media can then sometimes actually exacerbate that by pushing a narrative and pushing out certain facts only and sort of hiding the other ones. It makes it so that we end up getting a skewed picture.
And they may not even be aware that they're doing it.
Yep.
You know, and
Yeah. It may not be
being
intentional.
being more curious about those things and more open-minded. That's I think an important goal to pursue. But back on Christopher's topic of how we can really supply for race data, because all that we've been talking about is trying to identify and hopefully propose measures to assist with problems of racism, and specifically we've looked at like racism in law enforcement. But if we were to hand down a universal reporting method for law enforcement agencies across the United States, which they were legally obligated to adhere to, what instructions would they be given for identifying a person's race? Would it just be?
Here's the question: If over time there's sufficient phenotypical variation between us and our descendants, if existent, what happens if our categories cease to be relevant?
Well, I think for something like that, we could still amend the methodology, because the methods in this case are to address certain prevalent social issues today. We don't know that those same social issues are going to be prevalent tomorrow, but
these questions are deep, man.
Yeah.
You ask difficult questions.
We've got a good selection of people that doing unique jobs.
Alan, when you're finished, I'll be happy to address that question.
Okay, well, it's like I'm sure that there is something that could be presented as evidence, but I'm not sure of the veracity of whatever you would present as evidence to support those points. But yeah, Carla.
Okay, if anyone's not looking in the comments, the question is there any evidence for institutional racism and why? Black Lives Matter. Is Black Lives Matter rooted in
I was looking at that.
What does it mean to say a life matters? So the first question, evidence for institutional racism. I would argue that disproportionate sentencing is an example of institutional racism. I think the Justice Department or justice policy and the inequitable distribution of justice is one of the more profound examples of institutional racism. Looking at
we may have to have a part 2 to this discussion, because on those data points, Carla, which I think are very pertinent, I have to check them, because remember, from the supposition that there's disproportionality, that doesn't imply the rate is not the same. Because if the population.
Okay. So let me preface my response with
I've got to look over the data, basically.
Qualifying that Christopher does not.
I don't know. Surprised.
Concede that the data is all accurate.
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. He doesn't know. Okay. Yeah. So, but let's, based on the data that is currently available, that scholars have deemed legitimate, there is an inequitable distribution of justice that disproportionately harms communities of color. And that can be found in sentencing, in drug laws, in targeting, looking at street crime versus white collar crime, and how those crimes are punished, for example. We can look at healthcare, where people of color are disproportionately underinsured or uninsured. The earnings gap, the wealth gap, the financial crisis.
Right. But Carla, behind every one of those data points is a set of data and statistical inference that I'd have to check.
Okay, and I conceded that point. right?
Yeah, I don't know. And I'm not
Okay.
saying, again, that doesn't mean you're wrong, and other people can extrapolate from what you say for what they will.
Right. So I'm speaking based on the body of research that social science has accepted as legitimate and reliable.
Yeah.
And Christopher can question the legitimacy and reliability, and I encourage everyone to be skeptical of data. And so I think that is that matters, right?
Well,
And
it's
to
also
be clear, though, I'm not skeptical in the "it must be wrong" sense. I don't
no,
know.
I know.
I just want to
No,
be.
but-
I just want to
Right.
be clear.
That's not what I mean by skeptical. I mean question.
but it's
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's also fair to assume that in all of these different sets of data that demonstrate this disparity, there's not a uniform standard for the application of a specific racial identity, which is the same problem that we get into. It's like if we want to collect truly valid and actionable data, that's something that has to be defined in some
Right.
capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to briefly respond to the last couple of points, and then I think we'll probably wrap up.
That sounds great.
So yeah, is Black Lives Matter rooted in Marxism? I would say no. I think that Marxism. I think that. I think communism is a utopian ideal that's unachievable. So I think that Black Lives Matter. I mean, I kind of maybe get where you're going in terms of egalitarianism, and so from that perspective, perhaps so.
I think that also
but
like one of the founders
looking at like the ownership of the means of production, I don't think that's what BML is all about. What does it mean to say a life matters? It's not so much to say like, the point isn't so much Black Lives Matter. Unfortunately, the movement has had to qualify that with Black Lives Matter too, right? Black Lives Matter also. And the point is that the disproportionate number or disproportionate percentages of Blacks who are killed by police. And when we then to that last point, gaps don't imply intent against a specific race. Intent, I would argue, is only partially relevant because if policies are racist, then whether they are intentionally racist or not doesn't have anything to do with whether harm is imposed. And so I can have the purest of intentions, but enact policy that imposes harm. And so the harm to the recipient is there regardless of whether I have malicious intent.
Yeah.
And I'm going to stop there and let you guys wrap it up because I know we've been going on like
2 hours.
Can I just say before as well, I wanted to add to Carla's point where she was sort of saying that like it's definitely valid to have the scientific method and stuff like that and everything, but sometimes like I haven't done her amount of research into this field by any stretch of the imagination. However, the stuff that I did do did lead me down towards the feeling that there might be some sort of disparity going on there when it comes to the sentencings of certain things, when it comes to like the schools and things like that. So I'm not saying that it's 100% right on everything, but from what I can see, there's definitely a lot of weight to the stuff that you're saying, Carla, not just from the scholars, but also from observing recent history.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And the inability to concretize something doesn't necessarily imply that the intuition is insubstantive. And I don't mean to insinuate that. As much as motivated discussion about better data acquisition and careful analysis of the underlying philosophical implications behind statements or even terms, because sometimes there have been so many instances historically where people thought they understood something, as far as I'm aware, and it turns out they didn't.
The Earth is flat.
Yep. But I think we've had a good run. I really appreciated having you on, Carla. You've been great.
Yeah, you've been excellent.
My pleasure.
I thank those in attendance for watching, and I think we'll end the broadcast here. So until next time.